Hi, welcome back. Thanks for watching. Today it's Christian attitudes to genetic engineering. So year 2 Christianity and science, but a big overlap with ethics. So be aware of that because this is the sort of area that a dialogues question could easily come from. So the question that I've got on the screen, is the oncomouse part of God's creation? The oncomouse refers actually to a picture in the textbook of a mouse with a human ear on its back. You might be familiar with this picture, and even if you haven't seen it in the textbook, you might have seen it somewhere else. The oncomouse was developed as part of oncology research, and oncology is the branch of medicine to do with exploring, treating and curing cancer. Cancer in humans is what I mean. And so you might wonder what a mouse with a human ear on its back has to do with cancer. And I don't really know, but this happens as part of scientific exploration. Sometimes animals are modified, they are changed. Experiments take place to try and advance our knowledge of genetics, of the human body, and of disease. And this is all geared towards curing human illnesses, reducing suffering, and from a Christian point of view, many people are very much on board with that as a principle. But what Christians also have to worry about is how far should it go? Are there certain things in the field of genetic engineering that shouldn't be done? And I think most people, Christians and non-Christians, would say, well, yes, there do have to be some limits, but it's a case of deciding what those limits are. So that's the issue for Christians, and that's what we need to look at as well for the exam. So to get into the questions a little bit more, we've got a few here. In order to improve the human species, possibly to enable our survival in a deteriorating environment, should genetic engineering be introduced to weed out genetic defects? So what this is asking is, in a future world which may be more difficult to inhabit than the one we've got, should we start genetically engineering our children in order to make future generations genetically stronger? Now, there's an argument for that, because if the world's going to get harder to live in because of climate change, natural disasters, or something else, it could be argued that that's a kindness to weed out genetic defects so that people are more able to survive. But anything where we're weeding out genetic defects has got another ethical dimension to it, which is that it could be seen as very, very ableist, i.e. prioritising stronger people over perhaps people who have a disability or a genetic defect in some way. And if Christians are supposed to treat everyone equally, surely that wouldn't be okay. Second question, should genetically modified animals and plants be developed to benefit humans, regardless of the environmental impact? This is already going on. There's a lot of this happening, and it does benefit humans, and in some cases it benefits the environment as a whole. But it does very, very much depend on how it's done, and it can have a negative environmental impact as well as a positive one. And then finally, is it morally acceptable to make fundamental changes to animals, for example, something like the oncomouse, if it helps us to treat human cancer? Now, I'm sure everybody watching this video will have known somebody go through cancer, and it is horrendous, and a lot of work is going into alleviating the effects of cancer and possibly finding cures. And many people think that we should leave no stone unturned in that search. But Christians worry a little bit about that, because at what point do we cross the line into playing God? I think that's the main thing that Christians worry about. So we can simplify the two sides of the argument like this. And this is an oversimplification. You'll find lots of different points of view that fall between these as well. So on the one hand, some Christians are in favour of pursuing advances in genetic engineering because it can be used to save human lives and make human lives better. They may see this as a really positive thing. It's a good use of our God-given gifts of knowledge and reason. In other words, we're supposed to be looking for ways to make the world better, and that's what God wants. A good example of a Christian who's on this side of the argument would be Joseph Fletcher, who we know from Situation Ethics, and I'll say more about Fletcher in a bit. On the other hand, other Christians are very worried about genetic engineering because they see it as altering, manipulating, changing God's creation. They may feel that this means taking on powers that rightly belong to God. So other Christians, then it's not that they're fully against genetic engineering, although you will find Christians who are, but this is more of a worry about what are we actually supposed to do? What powers belong to us? What powers belong to God? It's that sort of issue. So to talk about the potential, so this is the positive side of genetic engineering, it's already doing a lot of good. So we have genetically modified crops already that can produce high yields, they last longer, they're more resistant to disease. There's no doubt that genetically engineered crops have saved people's lives and have done a great deal to end hunger and starvation. We still have those problems, but we've made progress. It can be used to do things like produce modified bacteria that can produce insulin very quickly. Now, if you have type 1 diabetes, you need insulin, you need it quickly, you need it cheaply. This is a good thing. It's got the potential to help develop therapies and cures for life-changing conditions such as cystic fibrosis, Alzheimer's. That's very exciting. And theoretically, it could be used to screen out faulty genes and eliminate conditions such as Down syndrome, which is a genetic condition. Now, some people would say that's good, but there's a big problem with that attitude, which we'll explore in just a minute. So if it's got all this potential, what's the downside? Well, for starters, if it was taken to the extreme, genetic engineering could be used to produce an elite class of humans, making society even more unequal than it already is, and it's pretty unequal. Now, that's a pretty strong argument on its own, but if you want to make it even stronger, you can throw in the idea that the Nazis were quite on board with creating an elite class of humans, and it's generally a good idea not to be with the Nazis on things. A great movie that I can recommend to you is a movie called Gattaca. Ethan Hawke, Uma Thurman and Jude Law. Great film that explores this very, very well. It's a really good story as well. And then coming back to, we could eliminate Down syndrome. Well, would it be a good thing if we could? Many people would say no. If you argue that conditions such as Down syndrome can be eradicated and that would be a good thing, you've got to think, what are you saying to people who have that condition? It's like saying that a child with Down syndrome has no value. You're arguing that people with disabilities are not worthy of life, and that's just another form of discrimination. That's deeply ableist. And many Christians would say, well, that's not where we are, and that's not where we should be. It's pretty terrible, isn't it, to think that, you know, you would be saying to someone with a genetic condition, oh, one day there'll be a world without people like you. You know, that's very ableist. That feels really kind of not okay at all. And then this is one that Christians are worried about as well in the long term. Genetic engineering could be used to produce transhumans. Now, this has nothing to do with being transgender. Transhumans refers to modified human beings almost with what we might call superpowers, like the ability to breathe underwater, breathe in space, giving us abilities that we've never had before. Now, going back to Fletcher, he argues that in a future world, it might be agapeic to do this. So it might be the most loving thing to do if it's what we need to do to survive. But most Christians would be very worried about that, because they would argue that if we did that, how are we still made in the image of God? If we fundamentally change humans from what we are into something really quite different, how are we still made in the image of God? they would be very uncomfortable with that. So quite a lot to plough through here, but we'll take it one point at a time. Genetically modified crops, many Christians are on board with this in quite a cautious way, on the grounds that it can help reduce global hunger. But if this had a negative impact on the environment and on biodiversity, that's damaging to God's creation. That wouldn't be seen as a good thing. We've got a natural moral law point to make here as well. If we genetically modify animals, remember in natural moral law, Aquinas is arguing that everything has a final end or purpose. That's an idea that he got from Aristotle. And if we genetically modify animals to serve some other end, we're potentially going against what God has designed for them. Lots of Christians are worried about using animal organs in humans. So this is a form of genetic engineering known as xenotransplantation, because of the possibility of diseases in animals making the jump to humans. One disease that we're pretty sure did do that was COVID. And I don't think anyone's anxious to live through that again. Some forms of genetic engineering get cautious approval. So somatic cell therapy, which is therapeutic genetic engineering to treat diseases, might be seen as compassionate and acceptable as long as safeguards are followed. No one can quite agree on what the safeguards should be. And just to be clear, not all Christians would accept it. Some would say that actually these things should just be left to God. Germline therapy, which is where sperm and eggs are engineered, that's a little bit more worrying to many Christians, because the intention behind it would be good. It would be trying to screen out genetic defects, but any unforeseeable problems that were caused would be passed down to future generations, because you're engineering the sperm and the eggs. And once that's done and a child is created, that can't really be undone. Enhancement therapy, which is what Gattaca is talking about, that movie that I mentioned, designer babies, in other words. This is rejected by almost all Christians because it would create a less fair world, and it would see children being valued only for what they could do rather than valued in themselves. So if you could design your children to have particular abilities or particular looks, firstly, that would create a huge amount of inequality. And secondly, it would mean potentially that you would create really awful expectations of your children because you've designed them to be a certain way and do certain things. So finally, I just want to talk about Fletcher, because he is someone that I think it's really worth referring to in arguments about this issue. So we've got a quote from him here: "Man is a maker and a selector and a designer, and the more rationally contrived and deliberate it is, the more human it is." So what he's saying there is that this is what we do. This is what we're supposed to do. We're always tinkering. We're always trying to make things better. And it's a very human thing to do, and we shouldn't be necessarily worried about that. If we're trying to push the boundaries, and if we're trying to discover new things all the time, that's not us playing God. That's actually just being human. So that's Fletcher's view. Like with everything else, he took a situational approach to genetic engineering because he takes a situational approach to everything. But he did write a bit about genetic engineering. So he didn't believe anything goes. He wasn't up for just letting this technology run wild. And he believed that proper controls should be in place. So big ethical questions needed to be asked. But he was positive about it. He saw it overall as a good thing. He believed that rules and principles based on religious dogma, so in other words tradition, or outdated Bible texts, should be set aside if love demanded it. So he was quite critical of the idea that actually the Bible could have very much at all to say on an issue like this, and that actually it's much better to use love, use agape love as your arbiter of what's acceptable. And Fletcher was writing it was in about the 1960s when he said this. He thought that there would come a time in the future when the world would get to such a point that it kind of wouldn't really be habitable anymore, and we'd have to look at ways to live underwater, or to live in space, or to live in much, much higher temperatures, all that sort of thing. And he was basically saying, well, if that's coming and we know it's coming, we have to prepare for it, and we have to modify ourselves to deal with that. That's the agapeic thing to do. Now, so far he hasn't been proved right, but that's not to say that he never will be proved right. So thinking about how far you agree with Fletcher on that one could give you some quite nice arguments to make if you were to get a 15-mark question on this, or indeed a dialogues question. Okay, that's it for now. Hope that's helped. If there's any more things you would like me to have a look at, I know quite a few of you are going to be in the thick of it, of revising for mocks. Some of you might have just had your mocks and you've got areas of weakness. If there's anything specific that you'd like me to explore, leave me a comment and I'll try and get into it. All right, thanks a lot for watching. Bye.